If you're studying A-level philosophy and ethics, subscribe. I am covering the entire course on this channel. Here we look at Kantian Ethics for A-level. This is the opening lecture. From enlightenment to exam evaluation, I'll give you a clear introduction to duty, goodwill, the categorical imperative, designed of all of the exam boards, and they link as well to utilitarianism and situation ethics, of which you can go back and have a look at my other module video series for these. To understand Kant's ethics, you're going to need to understand the world that produced them. Because Kant did not arrive at his moral philosophy in a vacuum, he was responding to a very specific intellectual crisis, and understanding that crisis is what makes his project feel urgent rather than merely academic. And it's this: the Enlightenment. The great intellectual revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries had transformed how educated Europeans thought about knowledge. The scientific revolution had demonstrated something extraordinary: that the universe operates according to rational laws and that human reason can discover and express with mathematical precision. Isaac Newton had shown that the motion of the planets, the fall of an apple, and the trajectory of a cannonball all obey the same equations. Reason, applied rigorously, could unlock the structure of reality itself. And this created an enormous problem for ethics. If science could ground knowledge of the physical world in universal, necessary laws discoverable by reason, laws that held for everyone, everywhere, at all times, why couldn't morality be grounded in the same way? At the same time, traditional sources of moral authority were under pressure. The institutional church's claim to be the definitive source of moral guidance was shaken by the very Reformation, by religious wars, and the growing realization that different religious traditions produced different and conflicting moral codes. Tradition and divine command no longer seemed sufficient to settle moral questions in a pluralistic, increasingly secular world. And Kant's question, the question that drives his entire moral philosophy, was this: can morality be grounded in something certain and universal? Not in outcomes that vary from situation to situation, not in feelings that differ from person to person, not in religious commands that different traditions dispute about, but something that reason itself can establish with the same rigor and universality as maths. And that ambition sets him against every ethical approach that grounds morality in experience. Whether it's Bentham's calculation of pleasure and pain, or Fletcher's situational judgment guided by love, Kant wants something more certain than ever, and he believes that he's found it. So who was Immanuel Kant? He was born in 1724 in Königsberg, a city in which was then Prussia, now Kaliningrad, in Russia, and he died there in 1804 at the age of 79. In between, he almost never left. He famously never travelled more than a few miles from his birthplace, yet he produced some of the most influential philosophy in the history of Western thought. There's a famous story that the citizens of Königsberg used to set their watches by Kant's daily walk. He was so regular in his habits, leaving his house at exactly the same time every afternoon, following exactly the same route, that he became a kind of human clock. The only time, according to legend, that he disrupted his routine was when he became absorbed in reading Rousseau's Emile and forgot to walk at all. Now, this disciplined and methodical character was not incidental to his philosophy. It was an expression of it. Kant believed that reason, properly employed, produces conclusions that are precise, systematic, and universally binding. His ethics reflect exactly that conviction. His method was to ask, what can reason alone tell us about how we ought to behave? Not what experience suggests, not what tradition recommends, not what produces the best outcomes. What does reason, operating independently of all empirical content, require of a rational agent? And the answer that he arrived at was revolutionary. Moral rules, properly understood, are not derived from experience, feeling, or authority. They are discovered by reason. And because they are discovered by reason, which is the same in all human beings, they bind all rational agents universally and without exception. And that claim made Kantian ethics one of the most demanding and most influential moral frameworks that's ever been developed. So, before we get to the content of Kant's ethics, we need to understand why he rejects all empirical approaches to morality. And this is the philosophical foundation on which everything else rests. Now, empirical ethics grounds moral judgments in experience, in observations about what produces happiness, what people desire, what consequences follow from actions. Utilitarianism is the clearest example of this. Jeremy Bentham observes that human beings seek pleasure and avoid pain, and builds his entire moral system on that very empirical foundation. Kant's objection is fundamental. Experience changes. What produces happiness in one context may produce suffering in another. What people desire varies between individuals and cultures and historical periods. If morality depends on consequences, pleasure or sympathy, it becomes unstable, contingent on circumstances that could always have been different. But Kant believes that a genuine moral law must be universal and necessary. It must hold for every rational agent, in every situation, at every time. The wrongness of lying must not depend on whether this particular lie happens to produce good or bad consequences. The obligation to keep a promise must not dissolve when keeping it becomes inconvenient. And the only way to achieve that universality and necessity is to ground morality in reason alone, independent of all experience. Just as mathematical truths hold necessarily and universally, 2 plus 2 equals 4 regardless of who is counting or what physical objects they're counting. Moral truths must hold necessarily and universally regardless of the particular circumstances of any specific agent or situation. And this is Kant's crucial move, and it separates him sharply from every empirical moral thinker. Connect this to what you already know. Bentham bases morality on pleasure and on pain, empirical observations about human psychology. Joseph Fletcher bases morality on love as experienced in situation ethics. And another empirical foundation exists there. Here, Kant rejects both of them as inadequate. Morality, he insists, must be grounded in something purer and more certain than experience can provide. Kantian ethics belongs to the tradition philosophers call deontological ethics. And that's from the Greek word dion, meaning duty or obligation. And the defining feature of deontological ethics is this: the rightness or wrongness of an action is determined by the nature of the action itself and the principle behind it, not by its consequences or its outcomes. And this places Kant in direct and deliberate contrast with both utilitarianism and situation ethics. And understanding this contrast is essential for your essays in all three of the exam boards. Utilitarianism begins with outcomes. An action is right if it produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. The consequences are everything. The nature of the act itself is morally irrelevant, except insofar as it produces certain consequences. Situation ethics also focuses on outcomes, specifically on which outcome, or which action rather, produces the most loving outcome. Joseph Fletcher explicitly rejects fixed rules in favour of contextual judgment guided by agape. Now, Kant rejects both of these. For Kant, the consequences of an action are morally irrelevant to its moral worth. What matters is whether the action is done from duty, whether it conforms to a principle that reason recognizes as morally binding on all rational agents. And this is the exam phrase that you need to know and use precisely. Kantian ethics is deontological because it focuses on what we ought to do regardless of the outcome. Write that clearly and deploy it early in your essays and connect it to the contrast with these other consequentialist theories. Kant opens his groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, the text that is in your Edexcel anthology extract if you're studying that exam board, with one of the most famous sentences in the history of ethics. Nothing can possibly be conceived in the world, or even out of it, which can be called good without qualification except a good will. And this is a radical claim, and it's worth sitting with. Think about all the things we normally consider good: intelligence, courage, talent, health, wealth, happiness. Kant's claim is that none of those things are good without qualification. None of them are intrinsically, unconditionally good. Why? Because all of them can be used badly. Intelligence, that can serve as a brilliant criminal. Courage can serve as a ruthless tyrant. Wealth can be used to corrupt and exploit. Even happiness, which Bentham placed at the centre of his moral universe, is not good without qualification. The happiness of someone who takes pleasure in cruelty is not morally valuable. Only the good will. The will that acts because reason recognizes the action as morally required is good without qualification. It cannot be corrupted. It cannot be turned to evil purposes. A person who acts from a genuine commitment to doing what duty requires has moral worth regardless of whether their action succeeds or fails, regardless of whether it produces a good or bad consequence. And this is what Kant insists, that morality cannot be grounded in outcomes. He insists it for that reason. Outcomes involve luck. A person can act with perfect moral integrity and still produce terrible consequences through no fault of their own. Kant wants morality to depend entirely on what is within the agent's control, their will, their motive, their commitment to acting from duty. And this distinction is one of the most important in the entire course and one of the most commonly confused. It appears simple but carries enormous philosophical weight. Acting in accordance with duty means doing the right thing, but for reasons that have nothing to do with recognizing it as morally required. The act is outwardly correct, but the motive is wrong. Acting from duty means doing the right thing because reason recognizes it as morally required. The act is outwardly correct and the motive is right. For Kant, only the second has genuine moral worth. His most famous illustration is the honest shopkeeper. Imagine a shopkeeper who gives all customers fair prices and correct change. This is the right thing to do. But why does the shopkeeper do it? Well, if the shopkeeper gives fair prices only because it is good for business, because customers will return, reputation will be maintained, profits going to follow, then the action is in accordance with duty, but not from duty. The motive is self-interest. If honest trading stopped being profitable, the shopkeeper would presumably stop being honest. Now imagine a second shopkeeper who gives fair prices because honesty in business is what reason recognises as morally required. Because a principle of honest dealing is something every rational agent ought to follow. This shopkeeper acts from duty. The moral worth of the action is genuine and unconditional. The two shopkeepers might behave identically on the surface. The moral difference between them is entirely in their motives. And this has important implications for how Kant gets evaluated. Critics sometimes argue that his focus on motive makes ethics unrealistically demanding. Most of us do most things from mixed motives, not pure rational duty. And this is a genuine and important objection that you should be using in your essays. Now, Kant's moral philosophy culminates in the concept of what's called the categorical imperative. And to understand it properly, you first need to understand the contrast he draws with hypothetical imperatives. A hypothetical imperative takes the form, if you want X, do Y. These are conditional commands. If you want to lose weight, eat less. If you want to pass your exams, revise. The obligation depends entirely on whether you want the goal. If you do not want the goal, the imperative has no force. All prudential advice, all technical guidance, all strategic recommendations, they are hypothetical imperatives. They tell you how to achieve certain ends, but they only bind you if you happen to want those ends. Moral commands, Kant argues, are different in kind. They do not say, if you want to be trusted, keep your promises. They say, keep your promises, full stop. The obligation does not depend on what you happen to want, it applies to every rational agent, regardless of their inclinations, desires, or circumstances. And this is what makes moral commands categorical. They bind unconditionally, simply in virtue of the fact that the agent is a rational being. Now, the categorical imperative is Kant's attempt to articulate what this unconditional moral demand requires. It is not one rule among many, it is the supreme principle of morality, the single rational standard from which all specific moral duties can be derived. Kant expressed the categorical imperative in three formulations. These are not three separate moral principles. They are three different ways of expressing the same underlying rational requirement, each illuminating a different aspect of what morality demands. Let's look first at the formula of universal law. Act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In other words, before you act on a principle, ask the question, could I consistently will that everyone act on this principle? If the principle would undermine itself when universalized, if generalizing it would make the very practice it relies on impossible, then the principle is morally impermissible. And the clearest example is lying. Imagine universalizing the principle, lie whenever it is convenient. If everyone acted on this maxim, the practice of communication and trust, on which lying parasitically depends, would collapse. The maxim defends itself when universalized. Therefore, lying is impermissible. Well, let's look at the formula of humanity. Act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never merely as a means. Now, this is the formulation most directly relevant to the justice problem that we looked at in utilitarianism. Harvesting one patient's organs to save 5 uses that person merely as a means. Framing an innocent man to prevent riots uses him merely as a means. Kant's formula prohibits both absolutely, regardless of the consequences. And finally, let's look at the formula of the kingdom of ends. Act as if you were, through your maxims, a law-making member of a kingdom of ends, a community of rational agents who treat each other always as ends in themselves. Now, this formulation introduces the social dimension of Kantian ethics. Morality is not just about individual action, it is about the principles on which a rational community could be built. Each agent should act as both subject and legislator in a moral community of equals. These three formulations together constitute one of the most influential accounts of morality ever developed. So let us now bring the evaluation together in a form that you can use directly in your essays. Kant's ethics have a powerful respect for persons built into their very own foundation. The formula of humanity insists that every rational agent has unconditional dignity that can never be overridden by calculations of utility or situational judgment. And this is one of the deepest and most compelling ideas in the history of moral philosophy. Universality gives Kant's ethics a clear consistency test. Any principle that cannot be universalized without contradiction is impermissible. And this is demanding, but it's also transparent. You can apply the test and get a result. And because Kant grounds ethics in reason rather than feeling, preference, or cultural tradition, his approach avoids pure subjectivism. The moral law is not what I happen to feel or prefer, it is what reason itself requires of all rational agents. And then think of the weaknesses. The problem of conflicting duties is serious. What happens when two duties conflict? When truth-telling would cause serious harm, or when keeping a promise requires breaking another? Kant's framework, taken strictly, provides no clear way to adjudicate between competing duties. What about the rigidity objection is equally pressing here. Most people find Kant's famous claim that lying is impermissible even to a murderer who asks where your friend is hiding morally unacceptable. Kant maintains the prohibition. Critics argue that a theory which produces such conclusions has got to have something wrong with it. And Kant finally may ignore consequences that clearly matter. A theory that treats outcomes as morally irrelevant struggles to explain why we should prefer a world with less suffering to a world with more. Now contrast utilitarianism here, outcomes and aggregate happiness, versus duty and the categorical imperative. Both of them have a strong claim to moral seriousness. The question is which one of them grounds morality more convincingly. You should contrast situation ethics, agape and contextual judgment versus universal law and rational duty here. Fletcher insists every situation is unique, but Kant insists the moral law is the same for everyone in every situation. Now, the key terms that you must precisely use in your essays are ones like deontological, goodwill, duty, maxim, categorical imperative, universality, formula of universal law, formula of humanity, kingdom of ends, hypothetical imperative, acting from duty, acting in accordance with duty. The next video in this series will apply the categorical imperative to classic cases like lying, promise breaking, and moral decision making under pressure. And that will show you exactly how the theory works in practice and where it faces its most serious challenges.